Hello, welcome to G's Place, and I'm your host, Gladys Thomas Toscano. This year marks the 50th anniversary for civil rights in America, and we are honored to have living right here on Martha's Vineyard a pioneer in civil rights, an activist, a journalist, a published author, and national and global correspondent, Mrs. Charlayne Gault. Thank you so much for graciously agreeing to be a guest on my show.
Listen, it only gave me not even a pause to be here.
Thank you. Well, this past summer on the Vineyard, there were lots of lectures and programs and conversations about civil rights in America. And I had the pleasure of seeing a selfie of Charlayne with former President Clinton and our current President Barack Obama. And it just stunned me how wonderful it was, and to see an icon like Charlayne and being a pioneer in activism and civil rights between a former white president and our current African-American president. And it just started me thinking about civil rights in America and how it's changed, and sadly how it hasn't changed. I met Charlayne last year at the Tivoli Fair in OB, and I purchased her book, autographed by the way, here it is, To the Mountaintop. And I read the book and I found it astonishing, all the accomplishments she has, and I just wanted her to be a guest on this show and share some of those experiences. And I'd just like to know, what is it like for you to have experienced what you did, being the first in so many ways for civil rights in our country?
Well, it's been an exciting journey. I like to think of Zora Neale Hurston's Journey to the Horizons, which started for me back in the Deep South in the years that I was in elementary school and high school that was segregated, both were segregated, and then to have an opportunity to go to not only the flagship university in my state, but to break a barrier that would open the door, not just for me and for my colleague Hamilton Holmes, who went in with me, but for generations of young black people, because this had been the place where the sons and daughters of white Georgia had gone. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it wasn't so much a step into, I didn't think of it then as a step into history, but an opportunity for myself in the first instance, but that would result in an opportunity for so many people. And I think that my book, To the Mountaintop, while you thank you for saying that it chronicles my own history, but I thought it was important to write about the young people who made it possible for Barack Obama to be president, maybe even for Bill Clinton, because they were the ones who sacrificed, and many of them died. Not many, but a few. Goodman, absolutely. Cheney, Schwerner. We could name them, Viola Liuzzo. Others were attacked. I mean, John Lewis, who's now one of the great congressmen here, there in Washington, he's so smart. And I can't understand, because he was beaten in his head so many times, you know, by the racists who didn't want freedom for African Americans. And so I wanted their story to be told as well as my own, because I think that as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, certainly Barack Obama was correct when he said, I stand on the shoulders of giants. And the giants he meant were the young people I write about in this book. Mm-hmm.
Well, speaking of young people, I am very curious to know, and I have a photograph of you entering into the school with Hamilton Holmes. I just have to ask you, what did it feel like to walk through that with the watchful eyes of so much hate and ignorance? How did you do it?
I didn't even think about it. I tell the story often that when I was in elementary school, it was a black school, and our facilities and everything else were unequal. We got the hand-me-down textbooks from white schools, often with the pages missing. So the black community in those days didn't quote the African proverb, it takes a village. They lived it. Mm-hmm. So they gave us a real sense of ourselves, and they organized to raise money to make up for those deficits that we suffered in a separate and unequal situation. And so every year, the family that raised the most money would have their child crowned king or queen. And the year that my family raised the most money, I think I was in the 5th grade or 6th grade, and they gave me a Bulova watch and a diamond tiara. And I often say that, well, diamond, but the notion that I was a queen took up residence in my head. And although I was insufferable to my friends for a few days because I was walking around like the queen, when I walked through that campus, when those young racist kids were shouting nasty things at me, I was looking around for whoever they were yelling at and calling now the N word, because I was a queen. And I think what was important about segregation and that village that most of us were brought up in is that they couldn't give us first-class citizenship. It wasn't the law that they were able to conquer at that point. But what they did give us in our neighborhoods, in our schools, and in our churches was a first-class sense of ourselves. So I didn't feel that I was diminished in any way. Vernon Jordan, who was a young lawyer at the time, and my mom, who was about 5'5", the three of us were alone. But we had so much confidence in, I guess, in faith that, you
need faith.
Yeah, you need faith that you would get out, you would achieve what you set out to achieve. So we never once were afraid. We put one foot in front of the other and kept on keeping on, just the way the same young people in the civil rights movement did.
Interesting, very interesting. Well, I love the book.
Thank you.
I love the pictures, but my absolute favorite, and I share this with you, is the timeline. Because it's so obvious, Charlayne, that a lot of time and energy and passion went into that timeline in the book. And you just, from 1797 all the way up until now, all the different milestones in the history of African Americans, it just took a lot of time. And I have to say, as a mom raising 3 boys and then doing many school projects, to all you moms and educators out there, this is an excellent resource book for those book reports that your children may have to do. Because Charlayne did all the research in the book. The timeline is amazing, and I highly recommend getting the book.
Well, just, I mentioned John Lewis, and, this book was written primarily for young people, but I find a lot of older people don't know the history. But I mentioned John Lewis because he gave a graduation speech this past year in which he told young people, get in the way. And so the timeline is important so that you can see the milestones, but the history is there to tell young people that no matter what kind of problems they confront, if they organize themselves in their own heart and head, they can overcome obstacles. A generation of young people changed the face of not only the South, but America.
Absolutely.
Because this was during the time when, U.S. was competing with the Soviet Union for who's going to have the best system, communism or democracy. And Robert Kennedy came to our school, and I was shocked to hear him say at a lecture that he gave that the graduation of Hamilton Holmes and Charlayne Hunter will be a great milestone in the fight against communism. So, I was amazed by that because I didn't expect it.
Yeah.
But what our young people need to know is that within them is the power to get in the way and change what they don't see as being just and fair for this country. Stand up. Get in the way.
Yes, and no, absolutely. Because this past summer, as I said, on the Vineyard, so many interesting things took place. And Carl and I had the privilege of filming Dr. C.T. Vivian and Congressman John Lewis in a conversation at Union Chapel. And I am telling you, it was mesmerizing. Yeah. The intelligence and the history and the memories that they shared with the audience. And what they did say was stand up. You don't have to, there's going to be fear, and you got to understand that when you're the first to do anything in life, there's a certain amount of fear or hesitation. But as we said too, faith. You have to have the faith and know that this is the right thing to do and stand on truth. And we're all created equal. We know that by God, if you will, and then also by the Constitution of this country. So stand up for that. Now, this is interesting. You realize that, as Mr. Kennedy said, that you will always be forever in American history as the first to cross that integration line into the University of Georgia. And since then, you wrote a book about your memoirs, and I just want to mention that as well. In My Place, 1992, she shares her experiences at the University of Georgia and what she went through going to school there, the classes and everything else. Tell me something. When you went back to that school and gave that commencement speech. What was that like for you?
It was very exciting. It was another milestone for me to be able to stand there, because the person who had given my graduation speech in 1963, mine and Hamilton's, was Richard B. Russell, who was an arch segregationist, despite the fact that we later learned he had a black child.
Wow.
You know, part of the hypocrisy of the South. But it was great to be there, and it took a lot of thought on my part, because I didn't want to just talk about myself and what I had done. I wanted to talk about values, and I wanted to talk about the things that were important to be good citizens. And by 1988, things were beginning to change. There were some black students, and I go back a lot now to the University of Georgia. I serve on the Peabody board that awards prizes to the best television work in news and entertainment. And I'm a part of that institution. I guess I spoke at Georgia Tech not long ago, and I said, hey, you know, I had to get permission from the Georgia Bulldogs to be here, because Georgia Tech was one of our arch rivals. In fact, it was the night that Georgia Tech basketball team beat the University of Georgia in a double overtime, when I was just at the university for 2 or 3 days, that helped generate the riot outside of my dormitory. The students were frustrated that they had lost, and all day they had been passing the word that they should come to my dorm and demonstrate. Hopefully, I guess they thought to run me away. But that night was the worst. They threw a rock through my window. They were shouting all kinds of things.
Goodness.
We were suspended. I was suspended along with Hamilton, who lived off campus and didn't know the riot was happening. Suspended for our own safety, but again, faith. I mean, my grandmother, my grandfather was the preacher, but my grandmother was the saint. And she used to teach me Bible verses. And at 5 and 6 years old, I didn't get it. I learned them because I had to. You did what you were supposed to do in those days.
And told to do.
And told to do. But the thing that came back into my head was listening to my grandmother as I walked. They had dispersed the crowd. They took their time doing it, but eventually they dispersed the crowd. And they dispersed them with tear gas. So there was gas in the air. It was dark outside. I didn't know what was going on because I had been inside the whole time. But as I walked out into that darkness, I could hear my grandmother teaching me, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. So you don't have to be you can be in an organized religion or one that isn't, as long as you have something that gives you faith.
Right.
And that was what got me through a lot of really tough times.
That's Psalm 23. Very useful in needy times. Trust me on that one.
You must know.
I do know. Well, I mean, honestly, anybody today, living today, because you're only here for a moment, you know, and we all have to deal with so many things in life, especially if you're raising children. You have children, and you know that when you're raising your kids, you have to put it in a higher power. You have to release it and let it go. Otherwise, the thoughts that randomly can connect in your head can fill you with so much fear, you're inoperable.
Yeah, you know, there's another good book, in addition to, I think, mine. I like mine. But when President Obama first was president, he had a spiritual advisor by the name of Joshua Dubois. And this is a young brother who used to send him a prayer every day and a scripture, a portion of scripture. And at the end, he'd either give him the prayer or he'd give him an explanation of what the scripture meant. And at the end of a year, he put those into a book called, I think it's called Presidential Devotionals.
Nice.
So every day, I open that book. Sometimes I get in a hurry and I don't get to open it. But a lot of days, I open it as soon as I get up to see, because it's on the date, that date, like today, it would be on today. And it's some amazing chapters or passages from the Bible. I have some issues with some things about the Bible and the fact that men were writing it and often were talking about things that happened hundreds of years before.
Yes.
But there's also some just good literature.
Good literature.
And inspirational.
And words of wisdom.
Yeah, and so
Yes.
that's what Dubois sent to President Obama. So when the president was here on the vineyard this summer, and it was a birthday party he attended, and they were on the dance floor, and everybody was dancing, and I danced up to him and I said, I just want you to know I'm reading Joshua Dubois' presidential devotions every day, and he was very happy to hear
Yes.
that. Yeah.
Because you ever notice how sometimes when you are reading devotionals, regardless of who wrote it, that sometimes what you'll see on that page is apt to what you're going through in your life at that time.
Exactly.
I always find that so amazing, and that's a God wink right there. But it really does help. It really does help you get through. But I also read somewhere, please correct me if I'm wrong, did you donate your writings and some of your work to the University of Georgia?
All of my material is going to University of Georgia. Most of it that I had in Florida is already there. They drove down in a truck and picked up. We spent the whole day going through things.
I think I saw that picture
Yeah.
of you at the end on the
You
back
were
of the
on
truck.
Facebook.
Yes.
You're on Facebook. And I've got a lot of things here as well. So the process hasn't ended, but I just thought that, you know, here was a historic place. I was a part of it, and where better to have my papers. There was a beautiful, I think, artfully done portrait that in the early days when I was at Georgia, not a lot of the professors had a lot to say to me. I don't know if they were afraid or I don't know what the reasons were, but there were 2 or 3 who were really kind, and one was an artist named Joe Swartz, and he did a painting. And I didn't see it for years, but when there came a time when the wife of the artist asked if I wanted it. I was living in South Africa, and it's a very large piece, and it would have cost a fortune to get it there, and it might have been damaged. So I asked the dean of the journalism school, who was then a friend of mine, if he would keep it for me. Well, he put it up in his office. And so anytime anybody would come, he would come and show them the portrait. Well, Skip Gates, Henry Louis Gates from Harvard, recently put me in contact with the Portrait Gallery, the National Portrait Gallery, and they now have they wanted the painting. So, and the reason I thought about giving it to them was a new dean was coming in. And you know, the old dean and I were friends, but I didn't know about the new dean. So when I saw the new dean this past year, he said, you know, we've made a copy of the painting, so we keep a piece of it here, a replica, as it leaves and goes to the National Gallery. So I've reconciled. You know, I spent all those years with my grandparents and my father and mother and grandmother, who were people of faith and forgiving people. And then I went to South Africa, and the history of Mandela is you forgive your enemies.
Yes.
And on the 40th anniversary of the University of Georgia desegregation, the governor, who had said no, not one, meaning black student will ever come here if I have anything to do with it, came and made an apology. He said he didn't realize.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So you have to grow, and you have to make room for people who demonstrate that they can grow
As
in
well,
ways.
that's
You don't
right.
hold on to things.
You let
know.
it go.
You
No
let it go.
grudges held. Well, now speaking of South Africa, okay, I know you did amazing things there in your
thank you.
career, and before I go into South Africa, one of the awards you won was a Peabody for Excellence in Broadcast Journalism for your work on apartheid's people, the NewsHour series on South Africa. And I have to ask you, Charlayne, what was it like to be in the presence of Nelson Mandela?
Well, when I went to South Africa in 1985, he was still in prison. And I'd been told that they had transferred him from Robben Island to a prison called Pollsmoor because, unbeknownst to everybody, he had begun negotiations to get the government to unban the ANC, not necessarily even to release him, but to unban the ANC and possibly release political prisoners. So that's why he had been moved from a very inaccessible prison, Robben Island. You have to go water, travel on water to get there. So he's in town, near Cape Town, and they told me that if I went on a certain hill, I might see him because he had taken up gardening, and he might be in the garden. So we rushed over there one day, my colleagues and I, and we got up on that hill, and I looked and looked and looked. I found the garden, but he wasn't gardening that day. So I didn't even get a glimpse of him, but I went back in 90 when he was released. And I had been told that I couldn't go unless I could guarantee an interview with Mandela. Now, every journalist in the world was heading to South Africa to see if they could get an interview with Mandela, and I don't know what possessed me, faith. I said, well, if anybody can get this interview, I can.
Good for you.
Well, yeah, but I wasn't sure.
Not know how.
But I had a colleague, Jackie Farmer, a sister who went out there every day to his house in Soweto and talked to Zwelaki Sisulu, who was the son of one of the men who was in prison with Mandela, Walter Sisulu. And she helped make it possible for me to get the interview. I'd been covering and following the ANC since I'd been there in '85.
Okay, now tell us what the ANC is.
African National Congress was Mandela's party. And so when F.W. de Klerk, the president of South Africa, announced the release of Mandela, he also announced the unbanning of the ANC. So I kept in touch with them, but I didn't know where I stood in terms of getting this most exclusive interview. But finally got it, and everybody was getting 10 minutes, and I said, I need more than 10 minutes, please. And so I got a half an hour.
Excellent.
And you'll find this interesting. I sat with him, I think, and as I'm putting on my microphone and he's getting mic'd, I wanted to try and establish something different from what all these other journalists had established from all over the world, you know. And I said, Mr. Mandela, I want to say that I'm so pleased to be here because I followed your struggle, because it's very much like the struggle I was involved in the United States, the civil rights movement. And before I could say another word, he said, oh, well then do you know Miss Maya Angelou? And I was shocked, and I said, well, I sort of knew of her, but I said, of course I do. Please forgive me. And he said, well, we read all of her books when we were in prison.
Oh, amazing.
And I thought that was so amazing, you know, and I couldn't wait to get back to America and tell her that, because everybody wanted to know what is on, this wasn't on tape, this was just him talking to me, because that wasn't the purpose of the interview, it was to ask him questions about, and you know, the other thing is interesting is that he'd been in prison 27 years. When he went to prison in '63, television wasn't what it was today, and people didn't ask him, you know, questions aggressively, and this it was just. But he was very reserved. He answered the questions because he's a very intelligent man, very articulate, and I don't think he ever said anything he didn't mean to say. But he didn't give up a lot in those days. But I watched him over the years, and he gave up a little bit more and a little bit more, and he got more comfortable. And finally, 1994, just as he was about to become president, I did my last interview. And I had been covering this since '85. So here was the crowning moment. I would get to see the president, the first black president of a democratic South Africa, sworn in. And I found out it was the same day that my son was graduating from Emory University.
Oh my goodness.
And so I'm sitting in front of him and I say, Mr. Mandela, this is my last interview with you for a while because I can't be here for your swearing in because I've just found out my son Chuma is graduating from Emory and I have to be there. And then he looked at me and leaned forward, and I think he, in a way, became the father that he had been unable to be all those years when he was in prison, and even before when he was on the run. And he said, why, of course you have to be there. You can interview me anytime.
Wow.
And it was true. I mean, whenever I needed him, when I moved back to South Africa and I needed to interview him, I could. And he always, you know, had a little wink and a little gleam in his eye. And my husband had done some amazing things for some of the young professionals, black professionals. He brought them to America and helped them to become at ease in white situations. They were already educated, like bankers and people with finance. So when he would see me, he'd say, how's the banker? And then later, when he decided to retire from public life, and he said, I'm retiring, don't call me, I'll call you. I would see him sometimes because he was still doing stuff. He got very involved with HIV and AIDS because his son had passed away from AIDS, and he'd say, how's the banker? Or then he'd say, Are you on pension yet? He had a real sense of humor.
What an endearing person.
Oh, yeah.
I just can't imagine the strength of someone to endure and persevere for 27 years in prison. I can't imagine that.
Well, you know, we talk about faith, but when John Wilson, who's president of Morehouse, spoke at Union Chapel here this summer, he talked about visiting Mandela in South Africa after he was out of prison, even after he had been president. And he said he asked him at one point, Mr. Mandela, how did you survive 27 years in prison? He said, Mandela said without hesitating, I believed. Wow. Isn't that amazing?
That's amazing. That's a lot of believing, Charlayne.
It's a lot of believing, but at the same time, a friend of mine here, a Thai woman who is a chef, Mai, was at my house talking to me about meditating, because I was juggling so many things. She said, you have to meditate. And she taught me how you can sit there for 15 minutes and just breathe and come up with a word as you exhale that makes you feel good. And after I heard John Wilson talk about that, my word is believe.
Believe. Oh, that's so true. That's so amazingly true. Thank you for sharing that with us. Okay, now what else I wanted to do was, I did mention your impressive career, but I would be amiss in my responsibilities if I did not tell the people of Martha's Vineyard the honorable company they are in. Okay, Charlayne Hunter Gault has received 2 Emmys, a Peabody, as I mentioned before, for her series on apartheid's people, a Journalist of the Year award from the National Association of Black Journalists, a 1990 Sidney Hillman Award, the Good Housekeeping Broadcast Personality of the Year Award, the American Women in Radio and Television Award, and 2 awards from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting for Excellence in Local Programming. So now I want to ask you, what was your most memorable moment in all those awards and all your distinguished career?
That's a hard question, because, you know, I think I've wanted to do what I do today as a journalist since I was about 8 or 9 years old.
Wow.
I mean, I used to read the comics when my grandmother finished the newspaper, reading the sports pages and the news pages, and I fell in love with Brenda Starr. And something in her reached my imagination in a very amazing way, and I've never wanted to do anything else. And so I've always felt that a good journalist is somebody who has a capacity to get excited about just about anything. I mean, if you sent the cover of the town council or something that wasn't that interesting, they might have been debating something very small. But you get excited because you want the reader or the listener to respond. And that's what journalism is. We used to say at the NewsHour, we produce news that can be used. So if I had to give you one thing that truly excited me, it would be hard. I mean, of course, Mandela, that was a coup. Ted Koppel and I were the only 2 people who got half-hour interviews. Ted then was with his late, night show. I got an exclusive with Hafiz al-Assad, who was the father of the current president and equally difficult to deal with. And yet I got that interview through interviewing another president, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. Those are interesting, and those are what you would call scoops. But I think that the most important work I've ever done is the work that I did and do covering ordinary people and giving voice to people who otherwise wouldn't have a voice. When I covered Africa, I actually got 2 Peabodys. The second one I'm proud of because it was my first year living in South Africa and I was working for NPR. And I used to travel all over the continent. And I got a Peabody for that because I was talking to Africans whose voices hadn't been heard. Yes. And so I continue to do that. Therefore, that question is not only difficult, it's impossible to answer. Sorry.
Well, that's good. No, it's good because a lot of people would just spurt off something you know, but it just goes to show you how diverse and how broad your whole life is and your whole journalism career, that you have so many wonderful moments that it's hard to just label one as the most memorable.
Absolutely.
Which is great. And then the other thing I wanted to ask you about was the Venture of Winemaking.
That's great. That's
Yes,
a great one.
yes.
Well, you know, our wine label is called Passages.
Yes.
We developed our taste for all things good in South Africa. It's people, its history, its progression as a young democracy. And then we made it a point to not live in a bubble. Most of our friends were South Africans. We had American friends too, and they were all ages. And South Africans love wine, and we came to love wine also. And there came a point when we decided that we would try our hand at it, and it's been pretty successful. We called it Passages because it reflects our passages through life.
Oh, great name.
Yeah, and we make 4 varietals. I created the Charlayne because the first batch I didn't like at all because it was more to the South African taste, which is a little more stringent. And I thought the American palate liked the slightly rounder taste
of wine, yeah.
And so I changed the formula for that. And then we make a Pinotage, which is unique to South Africa. That comes straight out of South Africa, not anywhere else. And then we make that's a red, and we make a Merlot, which is a red, slightly heavier. And then we make a blend of Cabernet Merlot. It's a blend, and it's slightly heavier than the Pinotage or the Merlot. And so whatever your taste is, I think we have something that can satisfy it.
I bet it can. I love wine, especially red wine and Cabernet Sauvignon. So when I read that, I was like, uh-oh, Charlayne, where do we get this wine?
Yes, well, you know, we've had some good experiences, especially on the vineyard. Jim's spirit store has been extremely receptive, and Tony's market. For some reason, we've had trouble with our market, and I don't understand why, but you know, that's life. But we're in a lot of restaurants, and I guess the good news as well as the bad news is that almost everybody is out of it right now. Somebody at Tony said to me the other day, I said, "Do you have any more of our Chardonnay? I didn't see any back there." She said, "Because we only have 4 bottles of your wine left altogether."
Oh,
so
that's good.
yeah, it's good, and we're building it and enjoying the process. We're in 7 or 8 states, and you know, it's still a mom and pop operation, so you have to find people who can represent you in these places, because you can't represent yourself. You can go and sell the wine to people, to wholesale distributors, but you can't do that yourself.
No.
So we work on cultivating people who can do it, and we so much appreciate all of the people on the vineyard, especially those who carry the wine, and the restaurants like Saltwater and Atria,
Nice.
and the One Up Island
State Road?
Which is soon going to own Saltwater.
Interesting. I'm learning so much from you.
Yeah, it's going to be called Beach Road.
Nice.
Yeah, and we hope they'll continue to carry the wine, but we continue to expand into Soigné. Pappy carries it, and so it's fun. It's a business. My husband says now it's more than a hobby. We're trying to sell the wine.
Yeah.
But I just like it when people come and say, "Oh," and when they come to our house here on the vineyard, it's really like an African market, because my daughter's selling art, I'm selling books, my husband's selling wine, so you get a little bit of everything.
Nice.
at 9 Spruce Avenue.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Oh, well, you know what? I'm so glad that you agreed to do this show. I really enjoyed this. I really
thank
did,
you.
and I hope you'll come back on and we can talk about other things.
Happy to, anytime.
That would be great. But what I would like you to do is just maybe look in that camera and tell young people something inspirational, just like stand up, you know, be counted. Life is too short not to matter.
Well, you know, I think Frantz Fanon hit it on the spot. You know, he was a French revolutionary, and he said that each generation must, out of relative obscurity, find its own mission and embrace it or reject it. And I think that the thing that goes with that is what Barack Obama said, that our Constitution, the preamble to the Constitution, talks about a more perfect union. It doesn't say a perfect union. So that in and of itself tells each and every citizen that if you want to live in a country that meets justice and freedom and equality for all, you have to keep working at it. So each generation must, out of relative obscurity, find its own mission, and we hope embrace it and not deny it, or, as John Lewis says, get in the way.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I
Well,
look
thank
forward to
you.
us doing this again.
Please, let's do.
And I want to say a happy anniversary to
thank
Charlayne and her husband, Ronald Gault. 43 years. 43 years. Amazing couple. He's so sweet, very nice, and blessings to them, and 40 more. 40 more years.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for joining me. Look forward to seeing you again soon.